the hidden valleys of Tibet and the stunning pyramids of Mexico, to the icy wastes of the Antarctic and the deepest ocean trenches, our search for Atlantis will take us all across the world to seek out ancient clues of civilization that perished before history had even begun. An object of endless fascination and relentless obsession. It is a quest through time and space to pivotal moments in human history, as well as the dark side of man's longing for perfection. The myth of Atlantis has cast its spell over generations, each trying to find its own unique vision of this lost idyllic paradise. Our journey will take us across oceans and continents and span 10,000 years of human history. A journey to find a magical lost world. The search for Atlantis has captivated some of the most restless minds and original thinkers of every generation. It is a search that begins here, in the most glorious city of ancient Greece, Athens. In the 4th century BC, Athens was a city preeminent in all the world, the very epicenter of classical civilization and a beacon of cultural and artistic excellence that has shone through the ages right down to the present day. And it was here, in the world's first democracy, that philosopher Plato wrote a story, 3.5 centuries before the time of Christ, that is the first account of Atlantis in all literature.
The fact that Plato originated the story of Atlantis gave it a great amount of weight. Plato was essentially the father of Western philosophy, and because what he had to say was so important and has remained important, it became much more acceptable, much more respectable, if you will, than if someone else had written it.
Plato wrote his account of Atlantis towards the end of his life, but it was first told at a dinner party that took place when he was only a young boy. An account that, somehow, he must have overheard. The gathering, hosted by Plato's uncle, was traditional to the day, where wealthy and learned Greek men would eat, drink, tell stories, and exchange ideas. Among the guests was Plato's teacher, the great philosopher Socrates, and perhaps it was to be near his brilliant mentor that the young Plato sneaked in to listen to all that the men had to say. The legend of Atlantis, he learned, was already generations old, handed down by a famous Greek sage and lawgiver called Solon, who learned the tale in Egypt.
Solon was one of the 7 sages of ancient Greece. He was a very, very important personality historically because he was a lawgiver and he established a basis from which Athenian democracy eventually developed. He was a poet and a scientist and a statesman. And one of the things that he did is to have visited Egypt. It's almost like a pilgrimage that all the ancient Greek sages made. And in Egypt, he first supposedly heard the story of Atlantis.
In the holiest shrine of the ancient Egyptian capital, Solon was shown records of unsurpassed antiquity, the secrets of a long-lost age when a civilization of incomparable power and prestige had dominated the world 9,000 years before. The Empire of Atlantis. The description the Egyptian priests gave to Solon of this mighty, vanished civilization is the starting point for every search ever undertaken to find Atlantis. A description which Plato says
has the great advantage of being a fact and not a fiction.
Atlantis was said to lie beyond the Pillars of Hercules, outside the Mediterranean Sea, in an ocean we now call the Atlantic.
Plato was very, very specific about where Atlantis was and what size it was, and he described it as being larger than the continents of Africa and Asia put together, and he located it very carefully outside the Pillars of Hercules. The Pillars of Hercules are what we know now as the Straits of Gibraltar, and when you locate something outside the Pillars of Hercules, you are locating it in the Atlantic Ocean, just to the west of Spain and North Africa.
Atlantis was dominated by a vast, almost perfectly rectangular plain, surrounded on three sides by high, very beautiful mountains. Possessed of abundant natural resources, rare plants and precious flowers of every description, even elephants and other exotic animals, Atlantis was a land like no other, where the people wanted for nothing.
That sacred island, which then beheld the light of the sun, brought forth infinite abundance and the blessings of the earth.
He tells us about the flowers, the plants, the kind of metals that people use, the kind of the way that each canal and each channel is built. He puts in elephants. In fact, it's only the second time that they're mentioned in Greek literature when Plato describes Atlantis. What does all that piling up of detail and very strange detail do? Well, it does two things. First, it makes it very exotic and something very strange. But because there's so much of it, it also makes it seem real.
On the edge of this plain, facing the open sea, was the spectacular capital city of Atlantis. Laid out in a series of concentric circles of land and water.
The circle for the Greeks, for Plato in particular, but for the Greeks in general, the circle is a perfect geometrical shape. Circular motion is a perfect kind of motion. By building it in circles, he allows it to manifest the geometrical perfection that he finds the world really exhibits, even if we don't see it every day.
Each ring of land was home to new wonders and marvels.
There were docks for huge numbers of ships and a causeway over which they could offload the riches that were coming into Atlantis. In other words, everything that human beings could need was available in Atlantis itself.
Connected to the ocean by an immense canal 100 feet deep and several miles long, at the very center of the city was the dazzling citadel of Atlantis, which housed the most spectacular treasures that ever graced the earth.
They had such an amount of wealth as was never before possessed by kings, and is not likely ever to be again.
Plato tells us that for long ages the Atlanteans lived at peace with the rest of the world on their beautiful island paradise. Unspoiled by their material possessions and great wealth, they were concerned only with learning, cultivating virtue, and living in harmony with nature. Yet finally this golden age passed, and the Atlanteans became like other mortals.
Human nature got the upper hand. They became tainted with unrighteous ambition and power.
Insatiable for wealth and glory, the Atlanteans pushed forward the bounds of their empire, enslaving all before them. Finally, only one city stood between Atlantis and world domination, Athens. But here at the hands of the Athenians, the armies of Atlantis suffered a crushing defeat for the first time. A defeat that was swiftly followed by a natural disaster that laid waste to most of the world, completely destroying the islands of Atlantis.
Violent earthquakes and floods, and and in a single day and night of misfortune, the island of Atlantis disappeared in the depths of the sea.
And within a day and a night, both Atlantis and the Athenians who fought the Atlanteans disappear from the face of the earth. The only ones who are left are a few uncultured, as the Egyptians still say, Athenians who no longer remember the story of their triumph against the foreign invaders. And that's why they have to learn it again from the Egyptians when Solon visits them.
It was this tragic tale, first relayed to Solon in Egypt, which many years later was told at an Athenian dinner party. A story that might have been entirely lost were it not for the uninvited young guest who, it seems, remembered every word. All of the other guests scoffed at this incredible story of a lost paradise, all save Plato's teacher, Socrates. In order to convince the others of the story's truth, Plato's uncle agreed to explain more. Zeus, he said, had convened a council of the gods and spoken to them thus. But at this point, Plato's account abruptly stops. It is almost as if something or someone prevented him from writing more. Why did he never finish the story?
We don't know why he never finished the story. He stopped it in mid-sentence, actually, and we can assume that he intended to finish it. He didn't die at that moment, and in fact there are works of Plato's that can be dated after the completion of Timaeus and Critias, the dialogues in which Atlantis is discussed.
Nevertheless, Plato's short account of an after-dinner conversation was the beginning of a myth that continues to inspire and provoke 24 centuries later. Strangely, though, despite Plato setting up the world's first university, called the Academy, the subject of Atlantis seems to have been largely neglected by his pupils.
The myth of Atlantis, the story of Atlantis, is one that people seem to have been disputing about from the very beginning, whether it was true or not true. And we have one of his successors who actually believed was a true story, which suggests that there are others who didn't believe it was a true story. However, what is interesting about the story of Atlantis is that unlike many other stories that people knew not to be true, this inveterate race of storytellers never picks up to make anything of. We don't have versions of Atlantis the same way that we have versions of the Trojan War or of Jason's expedition to get the Golden Fleece or all the other great stories of Greek mythology. Nobody picks up that story to make something of it. It sort of sinks very much in the way that Atlantis itself sank in the depths of the ocean for a very long time.
The myth of Atlantis would be lost, disappearing into the shadows of the Dark Ages.
Platne kartice, nove banke i svijet vam je kao na dlanu.
It wouldn't be until European explorers inaugurated an age of discovery that the search for a lost island paradise began with fervor. A search that would begin with the dogged pursuit of a mythical isle by history's most famous explorer, Christopher Columbus. The Holy Inquisition of Spain. Men of God scour the land, searching for any sign of deviation from the one true faith. In less than a decade, thousands have already perished. Jews and Moors, lapsed Christians and social outcasts, all consumed by the cleansing fire of religious zeal. In such an atmosphere of terror, Spain would seem an unlikely starting point for Christopher Columbus's unprecedented voyage of discovery. Yet it was to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, the very people who had set the Inquisition in motion, that Columbus would have to appeal to finance his bold plan to cross the ocean. Long neglected by the history books, the great navigator had a secret reason to undertake such a perilous voyage. Columbus had heard of a lost island paradise of untold riches and wealth, a mythical land called Antillia, a land that had replaced Atlantis in the medieval imagination. Since the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 6th century, much of the learning of antiquity had been forgotten. Suspicious of pagan wisdom, Christianity had evolved a very different vision of the world, one defined by the battle between good and evil. At the center of this world was Jerusalem, surrounded by the 3 known continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. Beyond this was a netherworld, populated by people who were not descended from Adam and Eve, making them, in the minds of many, children of the devil. But some, like Columbus, had radical ideas about the real geography of the world, ideas that had made him an obvious figure of suspicion. Columbus had a great ally, knowledge. Knowledge gained from travel stories and maps of dubious origin. Knowledge that might threaten his very life.
It took Columbus a very long time to convince Isabella and Ferdinand that he ought to be able to find something, because for the most part his ideas were ridiculed, and this was of course during the Inquisition, so that people who had strange or antithetical ideas were not only ridiculed, they were sometimes burned at the stake.
Mocked and abused even by children, it had taken Columbus 8 long years to persuade Ferdinand and Isabella to finance his voyage. They did so for trade. Muslim conquest of the Holy Lands had reduced their valuable commerce with the Far East to a trickle. A new route to the riches of the Indies had to be found.
Up until the mid-15th century, all of these precious goods got to Europe by way of overland caravans. But in 1453, when the Turks invaded, they cut off these trade routes. So if the nations of Europe wanted to get these goods, they had to find an alternate way, and that would have to be a sea route.
Above all, maps were the key.
To a European king, a map was treasure beyond anything else in the world, because it gave him access to the new world, to treasure, to the future. And everybody kept their maps under lock and key, and to steal a map from another country was a great coup.
Armed with the most recent maps of Europe's best cartographers, Columbus had a better picture of the world than most of his contemporaries. His maps were much like our own, save for one all-important exception. The undiscovered continent of America was entirely absent. These maps also suffered from another dangerous defect. No one knew what lay in the Atlantic itself. The ocean was a mystery.
It was a fearful undertaking. It was one that would not be taken lightly. There was still the existence of legends of sea monsters that would grapple with their ship and to pull them down. And there was always the problem of the potential of making it there, but can we make it back?
Christian folklore suggested an ocean teeming with islands, but how many of them really existed? There was one mythical island whose existence the great navigator considered absolutely certain: Antillia.
I don't think it was doubted that Antillia existed, and it was constantly shown on maps. No one ever doubted it. Its position was always in the middle of the Atlantic, and it would have been what they call the stepping stone route, that Columbus saw this as a good stepping stone on the way to the far east.
According to the writing of his son, Ferdinand, Columbus's fascination with Antillia began when he met a one-eyed sailor in the Azores.
It was while sailing in the Azores that my father, the admiral, met a one-eyed sailor to seek the story of Antillia.
The sailor claimed to be a survivor of an expedition that had glimpsed this legendary realm and told him of a land of 7 cities founded by 7 bishops in the distant past. Home to wonders and marvels beyond the imagination, Antillia was said to be a land of limitless wealth. Even its beaches were sprinkled with gold.
The final motive my father, the admiral, undertook was the hope of finding, before he arrived in the Indies, some island and land of great utility.
An island of great utility that was almost certainly Antillia.
We only have Columbus's journal. We know that he thought he was looking for the Indies, but we know also that he was looking for gold and spices and riches, and certainly at least part of what he was doing was looking for Antillia or Atlantis.
On August 2nd, 1492, as Columbus finally set off on his epic voyage to cross the Atlantic Ocean, he had not one, but 2 goals in mind: crossing the endless expanse of an uncharted sea and discovering the mysteries of an island called Antillia. History has recorded only scant evidence of the events of Columbus's momentous journey. We do know that when his expedition was 12 days out from the Canary Islands and 2,000 miles from Spain, he ordered his tiny 3-ship fleet to set a northwesterly course in precisely the direction that Antillia was thought to be. 2 days later, he ordered the ships to turn west again, and 2 days after that, they set a course southwest. After 6 days of searching, Columbus abandoned what appears to have been a frantic search for Antillia. The decision probably saved the expedition. Columbus had made a potentially fatal error. In common with the mapmakers, he had estimated the size of the world based on calculations of Arabic scholars.
The problem is that that measurement was made in Arabic miles, which are much longer than Italian miles, with the result that all the geographical thinkers take the Earth and be much, much smaller than it really was.
On the 12th of October, after nearly 3 months at sea, Columbus and his men finally made landfall. They had crossed the vast ocean and reached the Americas. Returning to Spain a hero, Columbus managed to persuade the king and queen to support 3 further voyages to colonize the New World. But Antillia and its legendary riches were never found. Its name now lives on in a chain of islands in the Caribbean Sea, the Antilles. When the Caribbean colonies he established rebelled against him, Columbus suffered the ultimate humiliation. Dragged back to Spain in chains, he died a broken man in 1506. But without realizing it, Columbus had played an essential role in the history of Atlantis.
They expected to sail across the ocean and bump into Japan, but there was a whole continent in the way, and this, therefore, especially because it was across the Atlantic Ocean, this gave rise, I think, to much more speculation about Atlantis.
A good example of how the legend has been adapted or is different in each age is the time of great discoveries, when Columbus was crossing the Atlantic in search of the Spice Islands. He knew the myths. He wasn't a stupid mariner just hoping to head off and find something on the far side of the ocean. He was looking for things related to the Atlantis myth. We know that other seafarers were doing the same thing at the same time. So there was actually one of the impetuses for the exploration westwards across the Atlantic was the Atlantis myth.
Amid the spectacular ruins of the New World, the story of Atlantis would now take a different turn, becoming the focus for one man's bold quest to discover the truth about his country and himself. 30 miles from modern-day Mexico City lies Teotihuacan, the spectacular city of the gods. It was already an abandoned ruin long before the time of the Aztecs, who regarded it as the birthplace of the sun. The Spanish conquistadors had been so overwrought by the city's majesty, one of their earliest chroniclers had written,
There is now no cause why we should any longer doubt of Atlantis. The discovery and conquest of the Indies do plainly declare what Plato had written.
150 years after Columbus had discovered America, such sentiments would inspire one man to come to this city of silence and search for physical proof of the lost legacy of Atlantis. A search that was bound up in his own quest to discover himself. Though much of his story has been forgotten, Don Carlos Siguenza was among the most brilliant men of his age. A poet, mathematician, astronomer, and engineer, Siguenza was also one of the first archaeologists in history. Born in Mexico City, Siguenza was a Creole and considered an inferior by the country's Spanish rulers.
Siguenza was a Creole, which means he was descended from Spanish parents. Although we know now that perhaps there were Creoles who had part indigenous blood, they were not at the same level as Spaniards. They were not equal. They were inferior.
Overcoming the prejudices of Mexico's Spanish overlords had become Siguenza's self-appointed task from an early age. He was determined to prove that the ancestors of Mexico's Indians had once forged a culture to rival ancient Rome. Siguenza had first learned of Atlantis while studying to be a Jesuit, where he came across the work of Athanasius Kircher, whose 1665 map of the lost continent was the first in history. Expelled from the Jesuit order for his lack of discipline, Siguenza turned to science, making groundbreaking studies of eclipses, before journeying to Teotihuacan to see the city's ruins for himself. What he found there overwhelmed him. Carefully measuring and recording everything he could, Siguenza found Teotihuacan's layout truly mystifying. A puzzle that appealed to his mathematical talents and would bring him back to this ruined city time after time. The city bore all the hallmarks of an advanced civilization, and Siguenza found evidence of astronomy, hieroglyphic writing, and pyramid building that was uncannily similar to that of ancient Egypt.
He saw many parallels between Egypt and the early Mexican culture in the calendar, in the way of dress, in the hieroglyphics, and in the pyramids.
Could the two civilizations have been related?
I have been stimulated by the great love which I have for my country, and in which would be found exceedingly strange information. This data will probably die with me on account of my great poverty.
But fortunately, some of Siguenza's works did survive, and we know that amid these vast monumental ruins, he believed that he had found the answer to the ancient riddle of Atlantis.
What he was trying to do, I believe, was to connect Atlantis, Plato's ideas, with the Bible. Siguenza would have jumped from the myth of Atlantis, which would have been kind of the foundation for him, to biblical prophecy. of people dispersing across the globe after the deluge.
Fusing scientific ideas with his deeply held belief in the truth of the Bible, Siguenza concluded that the destruction of Atlantis and Noah's flood had actually been one and the same event. A vast deluge, which had swept away a forgotten civilization, forcing its survivors to seek refuge in both Egypt and Mexico, where they built the pyramids before vanishing from history. Siguenza believed that if he could show that Mexico's pyramids contained hidden chambers, as the pyramids in Egypt do, his theory about Atlantis would be confirmed. Under the hot Mexican sun, Siguenza and his servants spent many days trying to find a way into the abandoned city's pyramids. But the attempt ended in failure, leaving Siguenza frustrated and in despair that he could never convince skeptical Europeans of the true achievements of Mexico or its connection with Atlantis. Even worse, disaster was about to strike. In 1692, a riot broke out in Mexico City. Provoked by cruelty and mistreatment from their Spanish overlords, Mexico's native population rebelled. Fires spread throughout the city. A mob broke into the Viceroyal Palace and set the country's national archives ablaze in one senseless act of vengeance. Siguenza raced to the scene. The archives contained countless documents that dated back to the time of the conquest. It was a vast body of evidence in which Siguenza hoped one day to find proof of his theories about the Atlantean origins of Mexico. Again and again, Siguenza plunged into the inferno, trying to save what he could. In desperation, he began paying rioters to salvage books from the flames. His entire wealth spent on saving just a few records.
I cut beams and pried open doors, and by my own effort, the best archives of the city were rescued from the fire.
Because of his efforts, much of our knowledge of early Mexico and its conquests have been preserved. Tragically, after his death in 1701, most of Siguenza's own works were lost. With no means to date the great citadels and pyramids of Teotihuacan, Siguenza could never have known that the city did not reach its height until 750 AD, 10,000 years after the date Plato gave for Atlantis' destruction. But Siguenza was right about the secret of these pyramids. They did contain burial chambers hidden deep within them, a fact that was only discovered 3 centuries after his death. Don Carlos Siguenza was the first Atlantis seeker to search for physical proof of the lost continent. But he was not alone in wanting to cast new light on an ancient legend. Across the ocean in 17th century England, 2 courtiers of Queen Elizabeth I were also immeasurably broadening the scope of the quest for Atlantis.
One of the reasons that by the 17th century the Atlantis myth had become reintroduced was because there was much more exploration under Elizabeth I. And there was a renewed interest in science in Elizabethan England. This obviously would have encouraged people to reopen the Atlantis story, and therefore people began once again, if not to look for it specifically, certainly to refer to it specifically.
Francis Bacon was a statesman, playwright, and one of the first modern scientists. Eager to promote the merits of science to still a largely unscientific world, Bacon wrote a fable called The New Atlantis, the first reworking of the myth since Plato. The New Atlantis told the story of how survivors from the original Atlantis had founded an idyllic society in the still unknown reaches of the Pacific Ocean and used science to uncover the mysteries of the universe. Like Plato, he left his story tantalizingly incomplete.
Bacon refers to Plato, so this was the origin of his story, but it is not seriously an attempt to resurrect Plato's Atlantis, but to create a utopian society that the British could look at as a way of rewriting the way people could live together.
But Bacon's linking of Atlantis to advanced technology would stay with the myth ever after, as would Atlantis' association with a rather different field of human investigation. Dr. John Dee was an alchemist, spy, philosopher, and physician. Astrologer to the Queen herself, Dee was also the most famous magician of the Elizabethan age. Using a method of crystal gazing, Dee claimed to have communicated with the spirits of Atlantis in a series of terrifying occult experiments. Both Dee and Bacon considered their Atlantis works so subversive, they refused to publish anything about them in their own lifetimes. And it would be England's great rival France that opened the next chapter in the story of Atlantis. When Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1799, he took with him the largest collection of scholars ever to accompany a military campaign. The finds and discoveries made by Napoleon's archaeologists generated a national obsession with all things ancient. In time inspiring a fellow Frenchman, Jules Verne, to take the story of Atlantis from the arcane libraries of a few lonely scholars into the imagination of the whole world.
Here were the encrusted remains of an acropolis, with the floating forms of a Parthenon. Here were the vestiges of an ancient port on the shore of a vanished sea, which had once given shelter to merchant ships and craft of war. Further still were the outlines of crumpled walls and long lines of wide, deserted streets. An ancient Pompeii, buried beneath the sea. Atlantis.
Jules Verne's image of Atlantis in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was perhaps the most spellbinding description of the lost city since Plato's.
It was published in 1870. Enormously popular book. The drawings that actually accompanied the book showed people marching around in sunken Greek temples, and this, of course, was kind of an interesting concept, and probably was the element that got people more and more interested in Atlantis, the idea that underwater you could walk around in sunken Greek temples.
Written in the 1870s as the effects of the Industrial Revolution and new technologies were rapidly changing the world, Verne's story of undersea exploration was a prescient guess at the shape of things to come.
It was really a Da Vinci kind of prophecy. The general population of the day had no idea about the oceans, really. Most people didn't know how to swim. Most people certainly had never been underwater. All they knew was that the ocean was populated by monsters of one kind or another that probably ate ships, and certainly ate people.
Verne's description of Atlantis, located in an abyss of undersea volcanoes in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, was so convincing that within a decade it would inspire a writer half a world away to prove that Atlantis truly did exist. Here in his study in Minnesota, Ignatius Donnelly, a failed politician, wrote one of the greatest bestsellers of his age, making him the founding father of the modern hunt for a real Atlantis. His ideas launched a wave of Atlantis mania that has been with us ever since. A former congressman and lieutenant governor of Minnesota, Donnelly had railed against the tycoons of big business who controlled the politics of the day, choosing to champion the cause of the common man. His idealism, unfortunately, brought only political and financial disaster.
He started a commune in Minnesota with a man called Nininger. The commune was called Nininger City. It didn't seem to work very well as an idealistic commune, and by the time it was over, there was exactly one resident there, and that was Ignatius Donnelly.
By 1880, Donnelly was out of office and down on his luck, and so he retired to his study to begin the work for which he is now most famous, a book entitled Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. Donnelly had studied Plato as a boy, and the story of Atlantis had always intrigued him. With time on his hands, he decided to read everything and anything he could to find out, once and for all, the truth about Atlantis. Donnelly had been galvanized in his quest to find the location of the sunken continent by an archaeological find that had thrown all preconceived ideas about the myths of the ancient world into chaos. 10 years earlier, a German businessman turned archaeologist, Heinrich Schliemann, uncovered on the coast of Turkey the ruins of the city of Troy and many of the treasures from this mythical war between the Greeks and Trojans.
When Schliemann discovered Troy, it completely changed the way people looked at mythology and archaeology. Before Schliemann, people had thought that what Homer had written was fiction. He made this up. There wasn't really a city of Troy, but what Schliemann did was he read Homer carefully, and he figured out correctly where Troy would be located if you performed a literal translation of Homer.
It was this astonishing find that persuaded Donnelly that if Schliemann could discover Troy by carefully rereading Homer, then he too might discover Atlantis by rereading Plato. Obsessed in his quest, Donnelly tirelessly searched for Atlantis in everything around him until a thesis slowly began to emerge. Donnelly found evidence of Atlantis having existed in the similarity of plants, animals, and ancient cultures on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean.
We find on both sides of the Atlantic precisely the same arts, sciences, religious beliefs, habits, customs, and traditions. It is absurd to say that the people of the two continents arrived separately of precisely the same ends.
The pyramids in Mexico were very similar to the pyramids in Egypt. Their methods of writing, their hieroglyphics were very similar. So he deduced from that there must be a common source, which must lie somewhere in between those two continents, therefore in the middle of the Atlantic.
But where in the Atlantic might the remains of the lost continent be? By an amazing coincidence, the British Navy had just conducted the first undersea survey of the Atlantic seabed. It indicated that deep beneath the Atlantic, a vast ridge of undersea mountains stretched from Iceland to South America, their highest peaks being the islands of the Azores and the Canaries. For Donnelly, the riddle was solved. These undersea mountains had once been wholly above the surface, but due to their volcanic nature had sunk, destroying Atlantis in the process. When it was published in 1882, Donnelly's book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, was an overnight bestseller that portrayed Atlantis as a highly advanced seafaring empire with colonies all over the world. An empire that Donnelly believed
lived under a kingly government and had their courts, judges, records, their boats, their highways, aqueducts, wharves, docks, and canals. They knew the use of the magnet and of gunpowder. In short, they were in enjoyment of a civilization nearly as high as our own.
Donnelly's book sparked debates from every fashionable salon to the most prestigious academies of science. Atlantis fever swept the nation. In 1883, the New Orleans Mardi Gras even adopted it as its theme. Letters of congratulations arrived from all over the world, including one marked only Ignatius Donnelly, America. To Donnelly's astonishment, it came from William Gladstone, Prime Minister of the British Empire.
Though much pressed by public affairs, I have contrived to read an already appreciable portion of your book, and I am much disposed to believe in Atlantis.
Gladstone sent this letter and addressed it to Ignatius Donnelly, Esquire, America. And Ignatius, being an Irishman and not wishing to be outdone, decided to reply to him, and his reply said, "The Right Honourable William Ewart Gladstone, the world."
I could not but smile. I was corresponding with a man whose word was fate anywhere in the British Empire. I could have uttered a war whoop of exultation.
Because his book was so popular, people tended to believe that it was fact. A good parallel, I think, is with Peter Benchley's book, Jaws. What Benchley has the white shark doing in Jaws does not actually happen. But think about how many people read this book and became absolutely terrified to swim in the ocean. It is possible for people to take what is essentially a work of fiction, but if it's presented cleverly enough, and if it has enough science woven into it, to believe that it's absolute fact.
Flushed by the overwhelming success of his book, Donnelly, now a wealthy man, turned his attention to the truth behind other ancient myths. But none of his other books ever came close to matching the success of Atlantis, the antediluvian world. Disappointed, he returned to politics, again without success. He died in 1901.
In many ways, politics was his undoing. There's a quote from an obituary which says, "The memory of Donnelly the politician will die. It is for Donnelly the author that we weep," which I thought summed it up.
Donnelly's book began a tradition of armchair exploration that has accompanied the search for Atlantis ever since. The father of Atlantology, Donnelly was the first man to convince the public that Atlantis really could be found. Little did he realize that his work would prompt a search for the lost continent that was literally out of this world.